Hello, folks. How are you? It is Kevin, and I am coming to you on the Saturday after the day we were supposed to have our lecture. And apologies for the back and forth on that. I'm just at an event. I've been at it all week, and there's certain parts of it, unfortunately, that I absolutely had to be present for in terms of voting and whatnot. So it just ended up that yesterday at 10 a.m. was one of those times. So anyway, what we're going to do today is the final lecture for our course, Human Nature, Democracy, Sustainability, and the Fate of Civilization. So this is week 14. So I'm going to share my screen here and go through the presentation. And we will see what is up for this final lecture. So first of all, I want to thank you all for coming with me on this journey. I know this has been very, very weird and sometimes awkward at times with just doing everything online and, with the strike and all sorts of stuff like that. So yeah, it's been a bit of a wild ride, but I am glad that you stuck with me till the end of it. And in this lecture, we're really going to carry on with what we were talking about last week, which is the possibilities for change. We've discussed a lot of very pressing and very serious issues that we're facing, not just as citizens in a country like Canada, but really as global citizens, as citizens of the world. There are ecological challenges. There's challenges in terms of our political systems and how decisions are made. Challenges in terms of growing inequality, and of course, once more, our world is embroiled in war. So these are serious things. And yet what we looked at last class is that also human beings have a very powerful, very real history of changing things too, of dismantling oppressive structures, of creating new structures and ways of living our lives, making decisions, dealing with the world, new ways that are better and that are more sustainable and that are more humane. So in this lecture, we're really going to continue on with this exploration of what are some of these alternatives and how do we move from our current civilization, which in many ways is moving towards collapse, and moving it towards a more positive, hopeful, and sustainable future. So last class, I talked about these 4 key tasks that need to be accomplished in order to start shifting industrial civilization away from collapse and towards sustainability. And they were education, resistance, solidarity building, and finally alternatives building. And so we're going to start this lecture by looking at some of the possibilities for alternatives building. So really what we're talking about here is if our current institutions are dysfunctional in a lot of ways, how do we either reform those existing institutions? And that's what has been called sort of the inside strategy of social change. So that's where you're working within existing institutions, like existing educational institutions or government institutions or healthcare institutions, you name it. The inside strategy is how do you reform those in a way that makes them more sustainable and more just and equitable. And then there's also the outside strategy of alternatives building, which is how do you create new institutions? What new organizations and structures do we need, right? So we're going to look at examples of both. So starting out, let's look at the example of the inside strategy of alternatives building. And this is where you can change existing institutions in a way that makes them, again, like I said, more progressive, more sustainable, to bring them in line with the values of democracy, of equity, of justice, and sustainability. So a big part of this, folks, is that, one of the biggest institutions, obviously, that we deal with on a daily basis in terms of how our society functions is our government. And so part of renewing our governments and the ways in which decisions are made means getting involved in politics, making politics democratic again. And part of this is actually getting involved in elections, paying attention to elections, understanding what the various parties are and what their platforms are, understanding how they actually affect our lives, and then, making a decision to get involved at the municipal level, the provincial level, the federal level, You know, at each level, there's important things that happen. And again, you know, this could be a whole course actually in terms of how to engage politically. But, you know, in a country like Canada, certain things are municipal in terms of their purview, certain things are provincial, and certain things are federal, right? You know, so case in point, in Canada, a lot of issues around health and social services are and education are established at the provincial level. So, you know, we have a provincial election, for instance, coming up in Canada here or in Ontario on May 2nd, sorry, June 2nd. So that's an opportunity for people to get involved, to understand the various issues at play. Other issues are federal, right? So in terms of Canada's foreign policy, for instance, you know, Canada's membership in NATO, Canada's support of, you know, attempts at regime change in Latin America, whatever. These sorts of things are more federal concerns that we have to address at that level. And then in terms of municipal issues, there's lots of important issues around land use, for instance, within a city. You know, are lands being put aside for affordable housing, you know, for green space protection? You know, these sorts of things are really important municipal issues. So it's important that we get involved in all of them and try to make what change we can, because there are some things that we're going to need to reform. So for instance, tax structures, like that's one of those things that happens at all three levels too. We pay municipal property taxes. We pay provincial taxes. We also pay federal taxes, right? So how are those taxes levied? Where do those revenues go to? These are big issues, right? You know, obviously all the laws that govern our decision-making and our policies, the regulations, these things also, the way we change it is through politics, right? We also need to reform very important institutions like the military, like our policing. You know, if you can remember the Black Lives Matter protests that have been, you know, ebbing and flowing over the past, you know, 5, 6 years across the world. One of the things they've been focusing on is this issue of how might we do policing differently? How might we make it more equitable, more humane, you know, and clearly certain communities are adversely affected by the negative aspects of policing, you know, diverse communities, but also just poor people in general tend to have the legal system come down on them much, much harder than, you know, middle class or upper class people. So how do we change these structures to make them more fair? As well with our military, you know, how do we make it such that we're only using our military for truly just reasons around the world? And this is to say nothing about the people that choose to serve in the military. I think that's a noble and honorable role to play. They're not the problem. I think the issue is on the upper levels of our military. You know, why are we supporting certain conflicts and not supporting others? You know, why are we at times not acting as a force for peace at all in the world, but instead a force for sort of destabilization and conflict? Another thing that as well we can look at is expanding social supports for our most vulnerable people. You know, in a country like Canada, for instance, there's simply zero reason why anyone should be living on the street or living in dire poverty in threat of losing their housing. You know, that just shouldn't happen. There's no need for it. And so how can we create social systems that will actually support people and really eradicate poverty, which is what we need to do. A great example of this historically, folks, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so he's sometimes just called FDR. And so he was a Democratic president from 1933 to 1939. And this was a time where the global economy was reeling from the Great Depression, we call it now in hindsight. So there was a global economic collapse and incredible amounts of unemployment, lots of social unrest, lots of desperate poverty. And what FDR did when he came into power, and he did it through a lot of pressure by community organizations, by political movements, especially socialist movements, workers' movements, women's movements, you name it, civil rights movements, they were all pressuring for change. And so FDR, as a candidate, came in saying, okay, we need significant change. And he said, what we need is a new deal, he called it, where basically, you know, the government had to commit to helping working class people, poor people, and actually getting involved actively in society and in the economy. it was incredibly successful. So aspects of the New Deal involved building infrastructure across the country, building and fixing roads and bridges and this put people to work. It created lots of jobs. Also, as part of the New Deal were, better labor protections for working people, better social services, So this was a really important example of how if you get a group of people together, if you create a movement for change, you can in fact elect people who will do positive and good things, right, for your society, for your communities, and for the most vulnerable people. So that's an example from the United States. And again, if you hear this term New Deal, because it's used a lot today, they're speaking about this thing that happened back in the 1930s, this idea that government can actually help people. It still has a very powerful hold on the consciousness of a lot of activists today who are trying to make political change. They say, hey, remember the New Deal? Well, we need a new Deal, right? Or a Green New Deal. You'll sometimes hear that talked about. So an example of this sort of inside strategy of transforming our governments also comes from Canada. And so, the idea of getting progressive candidates elected, and by progressive folks, really we mean like political parties and politicians that are going to move us towards sustainability, equality, freedom, justice, all these things that tend to help our society survive. That's where we call a candidate progressive. They're helping us progress towards those things. Electing progressive candidates is very important. And there's a great example from Canada. And again, it was around the same time as the New Deal. So this is in the late 1930s and the 1940s. In Canada, there was a movement called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF. And the CCF was an alliance between different groups. There was farmers involved in the CCF. There was workers. There were, socialists. There were academics and intellectuals. All of these different groups came together, and they realized that they wanted Canada to change. They wanted it to be a more humane country, and so they had a very, very strong leader named Tommy Douglas, and that's Tommy Douglas pictured here. He was a preacher, actually, interestingly enough. So at the time in the CCF, there was also a strong component of faith groups, religious leaders who were a part of this movement too. And that's what Tommy Douglas was. He was a preacher. And they wanted to do some very progressive things. And they started in Saskatchewan, so one of the western provinces in Canada. And in 1944, a CCF government won the provincial government in Saskatchewan. And they call themselves a Democratic Socialist Party. And it's the first socialist government in North America in history. And what they did was a lot of really important things, and they did them pretty quickly. So in 1947, they introduced universal hospital insurance throughout the province. In 1962, they expanded that to be basically universal medical insurance. So what we in Canada today know as our Medicare first started in Saskatchewan with this Democratic Socialist government, the CCF. And it was a big struggle, right? So it wasn't all easy. The CCF got in power, and most people, actually the great majority of people, backed their changes, but not all groups did. So for instance, in 1962, when Saskatchewan announced universal health insurance for all the people in the province, the doctors of Saskatchewan went on strike. So, think about that. All the doctors said, okay, we're not going to treat patients. And the doctors were hoping to kill Medicare before it even really had a chance to get started. And so what the government of Tommy Douglas did, it's quite an incredible story, is they said, okay, fine, if you're not going to treat patients, Saskatchewan doctors, we're going to fly in doctors from all over the world, from countries that already had national public Medicare programs. And so it was, I think, fairly badass of the government of Tommy Douglas to do that. So they didn't back down in the face of the doctor strike. And instead, after a couple of months, the Saskatchewan doctors realized, oh, wait a second. First of all, the public opinion is against us. People want health insurance. Who doesn't? I mean, it's ridiculous, right? If you think about it, who wants to get sick through no fault of your own and have to spend tens of thousands of dollars out of your own pocket, right? Just to get better. It's crazy. And that's why people all over the world support public health insurance, right? So they won, the government won. They were able to face down the doctor's strike, and they were able to make Medicare stick. And then they expanded it across the whole country. So in 1968, the CCF transformed themselves into the New Democratic Party, NDP, and they went into federal politics and they pushed for Medicare for all for the entire country. So that's quite incredible. You got to think, yeah, it took a little bit of time. It took about 20 years of hardcore campaigning and political organizing. But in 20 years, Canada went from a country where there was no public health insurance at all, where if you didn't have private insurance and you got sick, you basically, a lot of people simply wouldn't go to the hospital, folks. That's what happens. You sit at home and suffer, right? And a lot of people died needlessly. We went from that kind of country to a country like we have today, where you don't have to worry about the cost of expensive medical procedures, most medical procedures, right? It still needs to cover more things, but we can talk about the need to expand that. But anyway, folks, it shows that victories are possible. You can change governments. It's not easy, but it can be done. So that's one really important example of institutional change, working from the inside, because that's what it is. Like if you're forming a political movement and you're supporting candidates, you're working within that system, but you're changing it as well. Another really important aspect of social change that we need to look at today is our electoral system in Canada. And so this is where there's been a big movement brewing over the past couple of decades to change the way in which we do elections in Canada. And so this means moving from our current system to a proportional representation system. So our current voting system in Canada is known as a first past the post voting system. And it basically just means that in every electoral race that happens across the country, whoever wins the most votes in each riding wins the whole election. And so it means that actually a lot of votes end up getting kind of wasted, right? Because the party that, say maybe one party gets first place in all the ridings, another party gets second place. Well, the first place party maybe gets 40% of the votes overall. The second place party might have gotten 30% of all the votes and not a single seat. So it's it skews the actual desires of people for democracy. That's what our current system does. A proportional system changes that, so that actually what you look at the end of an election is how many people voted for party A. Well, then that's how many seats they get. How many people voted for party B? That's how many seats they get, right? So the actual political will of the people is reflected in the votes, right? You don't get millions of wasted votes like you do under our current system. So proportional systems are much more fair and democratic. And what ends up happening in proportional representation systems is you get more coalition government. So that's when two parties have to work together. You get more minority governments, which is, again, similar to a coalition government where parties are forced to work together. And these are really important things. It tends to lead to more democracy, better decisions. Parties have to negotiate, right? As opposed to what tends to happen in Canada a lot is just one party gets in power, and then for 4 years they can do whatever they want. There's no one can really force them off their path, right? So proportional representation is something right now that in Canada people are pushing for and fighting for, and it would really change things a lot if we were able to win it. It's something to point out too. This is already present in most democratic countries. Most countries that vote for their candidates yearly in elections, they already have a proportional system. So this is one of the cases where Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, these countries have not yet brought in proportional systems. And not surprisingly, they're all countries that have real problems with their elections, right? And with electoral outcomes. So it's an important thing for folks to think about. There's also really neat things that are being done in terms of how government actually spend money, like who decides where the money goes. All that tax revenue comes in. What does the government do with it at the end of the day? And so there are movements around the world for what's known as participatory budgeting. And participatory budgeting started in Porto Alegre in Brazil in 1989. And it was brought there because of the victory of a political movement. It was known as the Workers' Party. And the Workers' Party leader, Lula da Silva, was a former steel worker, very committed activist, right, for working people and poor people and whatnot. And when they got power, they started saying, well, listen, we want to make it more democratic in terms of how the government decides to spend money. So they created this system of participatory budgeting, where basically 21% of the entire municipal budget, and Porto Alegre is a huge city, folks, like millions and millions of people. And so, but still, every year they take almost a quarter of the whole budget of the city, and they ask people how they want it spent. And it's quite incredible. And people vote, they create proposals for how the money is going to be spent. They debate the proposals, they vote on how they want the money to be spent on which proposals. And then the winning projects get the money, right? And so this is literally like people would be like, hey, listen, we really want a crosswalk here, or we really want a park here, or we really want this bridge repair, or we need a new community center, for instance, right? We need a new homeless shelter. We need more affordable housing, whatever. Like, these are the sorts of things that communities come up with, and they can directly vote for it and get it funded. What's really interesting is when Porto Alegre put this practice in place, the health and education component of the budget increased from 13% to 40% of the total budget. So isn't that interesting? What it shows is that if you let regular people into the process of determining spending priorities, then the spending priorities start to reflect what regular people want, which is more health care and more education, right? So it's pretty neat. So again, it shows that it is possible to make changes to our systems, to spend money more wisely, spend government tax dollars, which really are our dollars at the end of the day, right? And so this model has spread worldwide. It's really exciting. Even in Hamilton, they were doing participatory budgeting for a few years, and there are groups trying to bring it back. Yeah, very interesting. And again, very democratic. This is regular people deciding how their tax dollars are going to be spent. There's another really neat example of an inside strategy. And this is where you build what are known as sovereign wealth funds. And this is where a country which is thinking about its people and its people's future decides to start investing and creating a big national fund to support its social programs, its policies, you name it. And the country that by far has done the most incredible job at this is Norway. So Norway has what they call the Sovereign Pension Fund. It was established in 1990. So this is, it's been around for a while, right? It's been around for over 30 years. Today, it is a $1.3 trillion national fund. And it is by far the largest in the world. And of course, Norway by population is a very small country. It's not big at all. But all their people, literally, if you broke that national fund down, each one of them would get like hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? But of course, they don't do that. They keep that fund, the government does, to do things for the people of Norway, right? For that country. And how they built up this fund is really amazing. So Norway has oil and gas, especially offshore. So in the waters around Norway, there's a lot of oil deposits, gas deposits. And so, of course, big corporations go to Norway and they're like, ooh, we want to drill down, and we want to drill your oil and your gas, and we want to sell it and market it. And Norway said, okay, sure. But if you're going to do that, you're going to pay a lot of money to the government of Norway. So they charge corporations really high taxes and fees to explore and drill and extract the fossil fuel resources in Norway. And because of this, they were able to build up this huge national fund. And again, this national fund, folks, what is it funding in Norway? Amazing public health care, amazing public services, free post-secondary education. Like, if you lose your job for some reason in that country, like, you are supported, you are protected, right? The people get everybody gets vacation every year. Everybody gets, paid sick leave and maternity leave and paternity leave. Like, it's amazing. Folks, they do studies every year of like, what's the best country in the world to live in, the happiest country there. Norway is at the top almost every single year in a row. So they're clearly doing certain things right. And what's interesting too, folks, is that Norway's a free and open society, right? It's not a communist dictatorship. There's no one forcing everyone to do something. It is what I think we would call today as close as we can get to a democratic socialist country where people are free, you can start up a business, there's free enterprise, all that sort of stuff. But there's also, they look after each other. They have a very common sense view of like, we're all citizens of this country. So we should make sure everyone's got the basics, right? And this should make us think about, in previous lectures, I talked about how in traditional societies, they have this idea of the irreducible minimum, the idea that everybody in your society is deserving of a basic level of sustainability. Well, it's interesting. So that comes from very small scale traditional societies, literally the way we live for tens of thousands of years. And yet Norway shows that you could take that same principle in a modern, capitalist state, but with a democratic socialist government and society, you can pair that sort of freedom and innovation and all that sort of stuff, free enterprise. You can pair that with this idea of the irreducible minimum. You can still treat everyone like a meaningful, valuable human being. It's quite incredible how they're able to do this. And we might contrast this because in Canada, the province of Alberta has a similar fund, and they call it the Alberta Heritage Fund. However, it's a really interesting contrast between these two funds. So the Heritage Fund was established in 1976, 14 years earlier than Norway. So you might be like, whoa, this Alberta fund's got to be huge, Well, not so much. It's worth about 16.3 billion as opposed to $1 trillion, right? Not even close. And folks, the story here is that in Canada, we just don't charge fossil fuel companies that much money at all to go in and drill and extract and pump that oil out, mostly to other countries. We get almost no money from it as the Canadian government, as Canadian citizens. So it really shows the sharp contrast there. And that if you have a government that has the people's best interest more in mind, you can do things quite easily to build up your country's sustainability, right? So another really exciting possibility, folks, every country could be doing this. All you have to do is tax the corporations that want to extract your resources, right? And you say, okay, listen, you can do your business, but you're going to have to invest in the country and invest in the people. Another really interesting example of change happening through governments, through transforming governments, is around the environment. And so there are some countries that are leading the way on this. And in particular, I want to talk a little bit about Bolivia, where they have what they call Law of the Rights of Mother Earth. So they literally passed a law in 2010. And this law was passed by a really exceptional man. His name is Evo Morales, and he's in the picture here. And Evo Morales was the first head of state who was native, who was indigenous. And, when he came to power, he did a lot of really amazing things. He created lots of social programs, lots of things to help the poor in Bolivia. But he also, because he has that indigenous culture and worldview, he said, listen, we have to protect the natural world, the natural environment. Makes sense, right? It's what we've been talking about in this course. And so they said, okay, we're going to give nature legal rights, right? And so that's what the Law of Mother Earth does. It gives the natural world, like parks and waterways, fisheries, pasture land. It gives these things actual legal rights, so that corporations or even governments can't just trample over them and exploit them and destroy them, right? It gives 7 specific rights to nature. And it's probably one of the reasons, folks, why his government, unfortunately, was overthrown in a coup just a couple of years ago. A coup is when opposition forces overthrow a government through armed means, through military means. And so right-wing forces in Bolivia hated this guy because they didn't like the fact that he was making it more expensive for big corporations to basically just, rape and pillage the land of Bolivia. They didn't like the fact that Evo Morales was passing laws that benefited poor people, working people, native people. So they overthrew his government, and incredibly, that coup was then reversed. So the people of Bolivia sort of rose up and were able to get progressive figures elected again. But it shows you that, these things can be a battle too, folks. And it's not just Bolivia that has passed this kind of law. Ecuador and Costa Rica now have similar laws this way. So hopefully this can spread, folks. We could do this in Canada. We could do this in India. We could do this, in China and Taiwan. Doesn't matter where. In Russia, we could pass laws that give nature legal standing, that give people who, obviously, it's not like a beaver is going to show up into a courtroom and argue for the preservation of its pond, right? But lawyers acting on behalf of ecologists, scientists, environmental groups, it gives them legal standing to argue on behalf of nature, right? So this is very exciting stuff, right? It's happening right now in the world today. It shows, again, change is possible, So those are just a few examples of inside strategies of how we can change our governments, right, to make them better reflect values of sustainability and equality and peace and justice and all these good things. But there are important outside strategies that are needed too. And one of the big ones involves information. What kind of information we get, the quality of information that we get. And so, these institutions that are going to embody, new institutions, they need to embody sustainable values. And there can be many different kinds of these different institutions. There can be community organizations we need to create, ethical businesses, citizen assemblies, so ways in which groups can come together to make decisions, kind of like the participatory budgeting thing in Porto Alegre. We can create local economic networks, and this is where a bunch of businesses in a certain area get together and they decide they want to do certain things, like they want to create a living wage, for instance, or they want to encourage environmental practices. So for instance, in Hamilton right now, there is what's known as a living wage network. And this is a network of local businesses that all pay their employees what's known as a living wage. And a living wage is something that's calculated based on what area you're in. And it's basically how much money you would need if you're working full-time to actually be able to survive and sustain yourself. That's what a living wage is. In Hamilton right now, I think it's something like, $17 an hour, right? And so we have a living wage network. It's a group of businesses that come together and they're like, you know what? We're going to all support a living wage and we're going to promote each other, right? And so it's kind of cool. If you are a person in Hamilton and you want to know what businesses really, pay their employees a good wage, then you can find out, right? So it's kind of cool. Sometimes businesses, ethical businesses will come together and they'll create a local currency even. There's examples of this. For instance, Ithaca, New York. In Ithaca, they have their own currency that they've created, right? And it's designed to sort of keep business and economic activity local, right? So to help the local economy out. It's really, really a creative way to do business. And again, none of these things require the government. These are just people acting of their own volition, right, to come together and do these things. And one of the really important things I sort of started out by mentioning, I jumped the gun a little bit, is we need alternative media sources too. We need different sources of information, because the news that we get from big corporate stations like MSNBC and CNN and whatnot, and also government news sources, folks, they're biased, right? And they're often biased towards the interests of large corporations, and the government, that sort of thing. So we need good independent sources. And there are so many today. And actually, another course I teach is called Popular Culture, and we really get into this in greater depth. But I've just got one example here. If you're ever interested in a really good take on international issues, foreign policy, and politics, and again, these two are mostly US politics, but there's a show called Breaking Points with Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty. And it's really interesting because they come from different political perspectives. Crystal is more left-wing, Sagar is more right-wing. They agree on a lot, they disagree on some stuff, but they're very honest in terms of how they deal with issues. It's very refreshing because you will get a different perspective, right? And so that's an important example of sort of an outside strategy of creating new institutions, new media outlets. So their show Breaking Points is an example of that. There's some other really exciting examples of new institutions that have been created that really show us the possibilities. And one is an organization in Spain, and it's called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, or the Mondragon Cooperative. And this was founded a while ago, back in 1956, in the Basque region of Spain. And it started out originally as this small factory that actually produced parts for these little wood stoves that everyone was using in the countryside, in villages, right? Like, you know, poor working class people, farmers, they all had these little wood stoves that they heated their homes with, they cooked on. And so a group of engineering students and an engineering professor who also happened to be a priest, Father Arizmendiata, they founded this little factory, and they're like, we're going to produce parts for these stoves because they're breaking all the time. People need them repaired. And they decided to do it as a cooperative, which meant that all the workers owned the company collectively, right? And so from this little stove parts factory in 1956, there's maybe like 10 people working at it at first. They just kept growing. And today, they are a federation of 257 different worker cooperatives. And again, worker cooperatives, it's basically just any kind of business, but it's a business that's owned by the employees, right? So there is no just owner that's sucking money out of it. Everybody owns it collectively. It's very, very cool. Mondragon today employs over 81,000 people, and they're active in a whole bunch of different industries, right? You know, finance, retail, industry, knowledge, even manufacturing. So they're doing serious businesses. What's really incredible is throughout their whole organization, they have a 5-to-1 income ratio. And so an income ratio, folks, is like the ratio between the highest paid person in the company and the lowest paid person in the company. And if you remember a few lectures back when we talked about stratification and oligarchy, we talked about how high that ratio is in a lot of corporations. You know, in Canada, it's about like 200-to-1, right? Is the ratio, right? In big corporations between the highest paid person and the lowest paid person. That means that your CEO is making 200 times what, say, maybe your janitor is making, right? In that corporation. In the States, it's more like 500-to-1. It's crazy. In Mondragon, it's 5-to-1. Can you believe that? And folks, these are big corporations. They build train cars. They build, like, you know, airplanes and stuff, right? So this isn't just like rinky-dink stuff. But even in those big corporations, you know, they're finance corporations, they're tech corporations, the CEO is only making 5 times what the lowest paid person is making. It's incredible. So it shows a few things, right? It shows, again, this is not a government mandated thing. It's a group of people who decided, you know what, we get it. We have to run businesses. We have to produce things. We need an economy, but why don't we do it in such a way that we control it as workers? We're going to make democratic decisions, and we're going to decide to be more fair in terms of how people are paid, right? It's amazing. And they've been very successful, from one little co-op to 257 different co-ops. And collectively, Mondragon is the 4th largest industrial corporation in Spain. So they're not small. Spain's a pretty big economy, right? So it shows that these sorts of things are possible, right? And this is where, again, you know, if you really think about it, what did Karl Marx talk about? He talked about workers owning the means of production, right? Well, this is exactly what that is. But it shows that you can actually do it in a free and democratic way, right? You don't need the government to own everything. People can actually come together, create enterprises, businesses, you know, innovative, creative things, but they can decide to do it in a way that is fair and that is equitable. So Mondragon is a great example of this. And, you know, there's more local examples too, and more smaller scale examples. So for instance, in Canada, actually, they're based out of Toronto here. There's a great cooperative, and they're actual personal friends of mine. They're called the Fourth Pig. And the fourth pig comes from, you know, the story of 3 little pigs, you know, 3 little pigs and the big bad wolf, and the big bad wolf is trying to blow their house down. Well, they're like, well, we're the 4th pig. And what does the 4th pig do? The 4th pig builds eco homes. So they build green housing, very sustainable, and also affordable housing. And they're also formed as a worker cooperative. So in the Fourth Pig, all of the workers collectively own the corporation. And they do amazing work. They build things. This is just an example of one of the homes they build. But they also are consultants, and they consult with other developers around green building, in particular around a standard of green buildings known as Passive House. Passive House originally came from Germany, and it is an approach to architecture where you create incredibly energy efficient structures. And they use a lot of different techniques to do this. One part of it is that the building envelope is very, very secure, very highly insulated. Also, the energy sources used are sustainable. There's a lot that goes into Passive House, and you can create net zero buildings, folks. So buildings that it takes almost no energy to heat and cool. So it's quite amazing. And this is the work they do, right? So, and I've even included their website there if you want to click on it and just get an example of all the cool stuff that happens there at the Fourth Pig. So there's lots that can be done. There is lots that can be done to transform our governments, but also to create new structures, new organizations, new ways of doing business and providing services. All of these things are possible. They're actually being done right now, all around the world, right here in Canada, right? So what I want to shift our attention to now is, well, how do we actually get more of these things happening? How do we pull off these kinds of changes? And this is where I want to talk a little bit more about something I mentioned last class. If you remember last class, I said that one of the key lessons of history is that changes like this are never just given to regular people by the people in power. It's not just like the king or the queen or the political leaders or the corporate CEOs wake up one day and feel all warm and fuzzy and are like, oh, I'm going to give the working people labor laws and the rights to unionize. It doesn't work that way. People have to organize and demand changes. That's just the way it works. And so if you look at this a little more closely, you see an interesting dynamic that occurs in social change. And in the book, I call this the continuum of change. And what I mean by this is that if you look at any movement that's trying to change society for the better, maybe it's the environmental movement, maybe it's the LGBTQ movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the labor movement, you name it, right? The movement to protect the free internet, right, for net neutrality. Each one of these movements has various people involved in it, various actors on a stage, really the stage of social change. And these actors, these individuals, or these organizations sometimes occupy different points on a continuum between reformism and radicalism, right? And so what this basically means is you have, for instance, in an organization like the environmental movement, okay, today, you have people who are on the reformist end of the spectrum of that movement. And what does that mean? Well, these are people, for instance, who are maybe working in government and they're trying to write policies, like good environmental policies, or they're lobbying politicians, right? So they're basically going to meetings with their local MPs and MPPs and trying to get meetings with Prime Minister Trudeau or Premier Ford or whatever. And they're trying to convince them to do the right thing. Well, this is definitely social change, but we would call it reformist social change. And the reason we use that word is because they're not looking for any sort of radical, like, oh, turn the whole system upside down. They're like, let's make small, steady changes, little tweaks to government policy and whatnot, right? And so that's what they're doing at this end. Well, you also have people who are much more radical. And so they would be the folks, for instance, when you consider the environment, who would be like, you know what, we've got to stop chopping down old growth forest right now. So these folks are camped out in old growth forests. They are chaining themselves to trees. They are trying right now to stop that destruction and that damage. And we might say, wow, that's really radical, right? Again, not necessarily radical in the sense that, oh, they're crazy, but they're trying to immediately stop the problem immediately, right? And these are also people, for instance, who are saying, like, we need to stop all pipelines now. Just stop them, right? Stop them cold. Well, folks, any climate scientist or ecologist is going to tell you that that's actually exactly what we need to do. So again, we could say that's radical, but they're not crazy. They're not unreasonable, but they're just wanting to get right to the heart of it. But obviously, not everyone is ready for this, right? Not everyone's ready to just like all of a sudden make the change we need to make. So you have all of these other actors too, people using mixed strategies, right? They're trying to do a little bit of both, right? You see this in every different social movement. And what's interesting, folks, is that you need them all. And this is what studying social change shows you. You need the reformers talking to the people in power, right? But if you only have reformers, the chances that nothing really changes that much, or it certainly doesn't change that fast. What the radicals do is they help push things forward, right? So that the reformers and that the people in the middle, they can sort of say, hey, listen, you do it our way, like be reasonable and work with us, or else, these scary radicals are gonna, they're gonna build in power and they're gonna sort of, they're gonna really mess things up. So these points work together. By the same token too, folks, if all you have is a small group of radicals and you don't have people in the middle pushing for changes, and you don't have reformers trying to get the government to listen, it's easy for the radicals just to get isolated. It's easy for the government just to send the cops in and beat them all up and throw them in jail. And then, people forget about it, right? So you really do need all of these actors on the continuum of change in order to get radical change done. So I'll give an example of this too, a historical example, and maybe that can help us understand a little bit more how different groups fit in along the continuum of change. So let's look at the civil rights movement, okay? So in the 1960s in the United States, there was this massive movement, obviously led by Black Americans, but with a lot of other people joining it too, a lot of allies in white America as well. A whole bunch of people that knew that the racist basis of the United States needed to change, segregation needed to change. So if we look at the continuum of change, from reformism to radicalism, we can think about which different actors were at which different points on the continuum. So first of all, on the reformist end of the civil rights movement, you had politicians that were sympathetic to civil rights. They were open to the possibility that this needed to change. And Robert Kennedy and Jack and Bobby Kennedy, right, were both sympathetic to civil rights, but they were reformist, right? They weren't really wanting to shake things up too fast or too soon, right? But they were open to the idea of civil rights, to these sorts of changes. So then you had people who were, more reformist, but a little more on the radical edge, so mixed strategies. Someone like Martin Luther King. And the power of someone like Martin Luther King is he was like, listen, we're going to force the issue, but we're going to do it in a way that is widely supported. So this is where King preached nonviolent resistance, right? And it was highly, highly effective. And also, because of using nonviolence, because they were peaceful, because King was a preacher, and there was a lot of sort of religious faith behind his approach. It was a lot of Americans thought, this is hard to argue with, right? So he was very, very effective that way. But still, his role was to put pressure on the politicians, right? To put pressure on the Kennedys to actually follow through with civil rights changes, with desegregation, for instance, right? Getting rid of this whole, Black people at the back of the bus. Oh, this fountain's for whites, this fountain's for Blacks. Oh, Black people have to go in the rear of the theater, white people go in the front. Desegregation was getting rid of all that. And that's what King was fighting for. A little more to the radical side of King were a bunch of student groups that were active at the time. And these student groups came together in an organization called SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And SNCC they were nonviolent, so they kind of agreed with Martin Luther King, but they were more in your face. And SNCC would do things like they would get a whole bunch of students together from across the country, Black and white students together, and they would go down into towns in the Deep South. And they would, for instance, do these lunch counter sit-ins where they would go to restaurants that basically were like, yeah, Black people can't sit down here. Black people can't order food here. And they would go in specifically and they would sit down at these lunch counters, Black and white students together, and they would defy these laws. And this was another level of radical, folks, because this was seen as a direct threat to the racist forces that were in power in these communities. And this often led to like violent confrontations, assaults, these students being beaten, arrested, some of them murdered. Like, this was hardcore stuff. These students were incredibly brave from across the country, and they just kept pouring in, right? And it really brought things to a head in these communities, right? Because it created, you couldn't turn away anymore. Whereas maybe Martin Luther King would come in and he would do a march through a community. That's powerful and important. But then when all these college students would start sitting in at all the lunch counters and breaking all the laws and sitting in the wrong place on the bus, it really brought things to a head. Then even further down the radical side of things, you had groups like the Nation of Islam and leaders like Malcolm X. And Malcolm X was, a bit of a controversial figure in that he didn't necessarily embrace violence, but he did embrace self-defense. And his whole thing was, listen, if you try and reason with racist America, at the time, and they'll be reasonable, fair enough. But if they won't, and if they attack you, then you have the right to defend yourself. So this was what we call a more militant approach, more willing to use violence and self-defense, more radical, for a while, X in his early career was about separation. So he was like, you know what, screw it. Blacks need their own, almost like literally their own country, right? So he wanted to separate out from white America, much more radical, right? And then finally, moving to the further end of that, you've got groups like the Black Panther Party for National Liberation. And the Black Panthers were basically revolutionaries. They were like, you know what, this government is corrupt, it's racist, it's oligarchic, we need to overthrow it. So they were hardcore. Of course, they were all armed, right? And they were like, you know what, if it comes to it, if we get attacked, we're going to fight a war. Like, this is what we're going to do. So very, very radical. But also, it's easy to forget this about the Panthers. They also did amazing things in communities. They created breakfast programs. They created free medical clinics, free social supports and whatnot in poor Black communities. So they did a lot of really, really impressive work, along with being also very militant and in some cases violent. So you have this whole range of actors in the civil rights movement. And I'll tell you what's interesting, folks, is, so think about it. At the end of the day, you want to get the reformists to move. You've got politicians in power in the Kennedys who are like, oh yeah, we believe in civil rights, but, left to our own devices, maybe 30 years from now, whatever, we'll make sure it happens. Well, of course, if it's the 1960s in the States and you're a Black American, you're like, I'm not going to wait 30 years. Screw that. Like, we want change now. So then Martin Luther King would come into town and say, hey, listen, we can't wait 30 years. We've got to do things faster. So, but I'm peaceful, I'm nonviolent, I'm going to try and persuade you to do the right thing. Well, again, if that's all the civil rights movement had, I mean, yeah, it would have helped, Martin Luther King's nonviolent marches and whatnot, that would have helped. But it wouldn't have been as effective as if Martin Luther King could come in, and this is the way it worked, come into a town to desegregate it and say, here's the deal, folks. You can do it the peaceful, nonviolent way. That's what I prefer. But if not, you're going to get all these college students swarming into your town, breaking all your laws. You're going to get Malcolm X coming into town, preaching some revolutionary stuff, and you may even have a chapter of the Black Panthers open up in your town, right? So you could freak people out. They'd be like, like we don't want to deal with the more radical people, so they're more likely to deal with the reformist people. These things work together, right? Very important. But again, folks, if all you had was the Black Panthers, well, we have to look at what happened to the Black Panthers historically. They were basically destroyed by the American state, by the CIA and the FBI. They murdered Black Panther leaders. They framed them. They used, covert operations to break up their organization, to like lie and sow dissent and whatnot. They took out the Panthers because they were so scared of them. And so if all you had was ultra radicals, it wouldn't have worked either. They would have been isolated. They would have been crushed, right? But as it is, when you had all the different elements of that continuum, they were successful. They created real change. And am in no way trying to say that racism is gone in the United States. I mean, look at Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests. However, no one would argue that it isn't a lot different today, that there hasn't been some incredible change. And it's because of this continuum of change, because of this movement. So that's an important lesson that we've learned. Another important lesson is if you're going to build a movement, you've got to think about two processes. You've got to think about bringing people into the movement and extending your message outside. And there's a useful way of thinking about this, and that movements are like onions, okay? First of all, if you think about the membership in any movement, a civil rights movement or environment or women's rights or queer rights or workers' rights, you name it. Each movement has a hardcore of like really committed people, like they live it, they breathe it, they believe in it, but they don't tend to be very numerically large. You just always like a handful of people. They're the hardcore. And then outside of the hardcore, you have a larger group of what you could call your mobilized membership. And these are people who they maybe not organize a demonstration, but they'll show up to a demonstration, right? And they'll participate and they will support actions that the movement does. And then on the outside, you have an even larger group of what you could call your passive supporters. And your passive supporters are people who they may not even show up to many demonstrations, but they agree with the movement. And they're like, you know what, I'll donate a little bit of money, or I'll respond to a poll saying I support this. Or if it comes time to vote, I'll support a candidate that supports the movement's goals. So those are the passive supporters. And then outside of that group, you have what you call the indifferent public. These are people who are just like, they don't know, they don't care, right? And let's be real, folks, that's a lot of people, especially in a country like Canada. There's a lot of people who are like, yeah, whatever politics, whatever, I don't care, it's happening over there. And so these two processes are really important. So first of all, from a membership perspective, you've got to be thinking about the arrow down here. You've got to try and turn indifferent people into passive supporters. You got to turn passive supporters into mobilized members. And you've got to make sure some of your mobilized members will get committed enough to join the hardcore. So you've got to constantly be bringing people into your movement. That's how you grow your movement. That's how you expand it, right? It's very important. Obviously to get a larger movement, but also you need to be bringing more people into the mobilized membership and the hardcore, because otherwise the people in there will burn out. Like that can happen. I mean, I've described how some of these things take 20 years, 30 years, 40 years to change. That can be too much, right, for one person or for one generation of people. So you need new blood, new energy, new ideas coming into your movement. So that's really important. But a movement has another challenge too. If it wants to grow, it needs to get its message out, right? And so this is where you have to make sure that your message is going, from the mobilized membership to the passive supporters, or sorry, to the to the passive supporters and out to the indifferent public. You've got to be getting your message out in a way that is understandable, in a way that is non-threatening. And this is where it gets back to what I talked about last class, where how do you be radical in the sense that you're actually trying to fix things, but how do you be reasonable in the sense that you're not just freaking people out, you're not yelling at them, you're not accusing them of being evil people simply because they don't agree with you, right? That doesn't work. So this is kind of the dual challenge of movement building. You know, how do you bring people in? How do you get your message out? Both of these things together grow your movement. And movements that are good at this become successful, right? And they really are able to create incredible change. So, folks, you know, getting to the end here, I want to talk about a few signs of hope, okay? Because there are some signs of hope. Even though things are very intense in the world today, we've talked about it. You know, we have 12 lectures of it to refer to. There are some promising signs, some initiatives that are gaining momentum. So first of all, there's a movement for a universal basic income. And this is something that is really, we could call this an inside strategy of social change. And it's being talked about all over the world now. You can't get away from it. And a universal basic income is where you basically decide, you know what, every single citizen in our society is going to get X amount of dollars a month. That's just what's going to happen, right? And so that is quite radical in ways, some people would say. But also it's been shown by a few studies now to have incredibly positive effects to improve the health status of people, you know, the mental health, you know, people's ability actually, weirdly enough, to go and gain employment, to educate themselves. When they know they've got a baseline of money to fall back on, it enables people to do a lot of really cool things. It reduces crime, you know, all these sorts of things. So this is something that we're close to getting in Canada. We actually had a pilot of this in Ontario under the previous government, the government of Kathleen Wynne. It was a Liberal government. And they tried it out and it was working really well until Doug Ford got elected, the Conservative, and of course he canceled it, right? Because Conservatives are like, don't give people free money, they're just going to spend it on drugs or whatever. That's not what happens. But anyway, universal basic income, folks, it is being talked about literally all over the world. It's coming, and this is very exciting. This would be revolutionary in terms of its impact on poverty, right? There's also a lot of talk about a Green New Deal. Remember, this is something I mentioned last class. A Green New Deal is the idea that, hey, listen, we've got to transform our economy to make it more sustainable. This means renewable energy. It means energy efficient construction and transportation. All of this requires work, requires stuff to be built. So why not get a bunch of workers in like oil extraction, logging and mining, in these industries that we know we're going to have to scale down? Why don't you transition those folks into new green jobs, right? This is an idea that's also gaining a lot of steam, and it's very exciting because it could really help drive that transition to a post-carbon economy, which we need. We need it yesterday, right? Global climate change agreements, again, each time all the countries of the world meet, folks, it is frustrating and it is a little bit depressing because things aren't moving as fast as they should. Having said that, though, we've got to be clear, there is movement being made. And certain countries, folks, have just run away with this, and they're just going full bore towards a carbon neutral economy. It's amazing. There needs to be more of them. And again, some countries are really, really bad at this. The United States is, Canada still is, United Kingdom still is. So there's work to be done, but there is momentum here, folks. And that's why I've got a picture of Greta Thunberg here, because she's a great example of an activist in this movement who is really making an impact, especially getting young people involved in you know, marches for climate justice, climate strikes, you know, where they all walk out of school, which is awesome. There are also really exciting political movements that are happening around the world, movements for democratic socialism. So I mentioned before, Bernie Sanders in the United States came very, very close to actually being the president of that country. He still has a big movement across the country that wants progressive change. It's very exciting. Lula da Silva in Brazil. I mentioned before that, you know, he had been the leader of Brazil when the Workers' Party, sorry, was in power. He was briefly out of power. I'm actually going to talk about that in another slide. But these movements are there, right? There is a lot of appetite for people to have, again, aspects of what I would call a democratic social society, where You have actually more democracy than we have now, but you also look after people. You've got better social programs, minimum wages, basic incomes, these sorts of things. It's also really hopeful too that Native communities across the planet are taking the lead in resistance against pipelines, against destructive mining practices and destructive logging practices. And this is incredibly important. And it's also really important that other people start to support them more because Native communities are on the front lines. But if they don't get broader support, they get crushed by government and corporate forces. They get arrested, beaten. In other countries that aren't Canada, they get also just disappeared, murdered. So, you know, they need help, but they're not going anywhere. And in fact, momentum is building, right, around we need to stop these destructive environmental practices. So it is hopeful. Change can happen. And this is what we've got to realize. So, you know, I've mentioned before the Indian farmers. It's hard to underestimate just how big that struggle was. I mean, we didn't hear as much about it in North America as we should have, but it's incredible what they were able to do. You know, they faced down Modi and also the two most powerful oligarchs in India, who all wanted these changes to the farm laws, which again would have hurt small producers, would have opened up the farming system to privatization, would have helped the largest farm corporations more than the small producers. You know, but they successfully defended their right to a decent livelihood. You know, it took an entire year of protesting, tons of clashes with police and with the army. Hundreds of people died in order, you know, to achieve the victory they did. But they succeeded. You know, they repealed all of those laws that Modi was trying to pass. So an incredible, incredible example of what change is possible. And we're seeing this as well, too, in the sense that in Brazil, there was, and again, Brazil's a big, powerful economy in the world today, a very populous country. And they recently had really troubling things happen in that it seemed like their democracy was being rolled back. It was being dismantled before our very eyes. And so that was really distressing. So, you know, a little bit of history here. This is a picture of Lula here. Like I mentioned, this steel worker who became the president of Brazil. You know, in 2003, the Workers' Party took power in Brazil and Lula was the president, and they began transforming the country, creating all these programs to help poor people, you know, improving, you know, health, education, social services, all that stuff. And Lula had this incredible run and did amazing work in Brazil, and then he retired. And then his successor was a woman named Dilma Rousseff, who was once a student radical and revolutionary, and she'd been captured by the old right-wing dictatorship in Brazil and tortured. And so she was a hardcore woman with great integrity, but she was overthrown in what's known as a soft coup, which basically means that, you know, right-wing forces in Brazil plotted and schemed and were able to sort of falsely accuse her of corruption, get her out of power. It all later became clear that it was just complete BS. At the same time, Lula was framed as well. He was imprisoned. And the new government of Jair Bolsonaro took power. And Bolsonaro was an outright supporter of the previous right-wing dictatorship that had ruled in Brazil, you know, in the 80s. And a real bad actor, right? And so it looked horrible. It looked like Brazil had gone from being this, you know, progressive democratic country to totally transforming. You know, Bolsonaro is like to the right of Donald Trump, like almost a fascist. However, all of this has changed again, right? In 2018, Lula was freed from prison, cleared from all charges, you know, as have Rousseff has been cleared from all the charges. They were totally bogus. And he's able to run in elections that are happening in Brazil right now. And Lula's the favorite to win. So it's amazing. So it shows that, you know, even though right-wing or fascist forces can take out progressive leaders, can overthrow progressive governments, there are ways to reverse that trend without having to resort to violence, you know, to battles in the streets and you know, an armed revolution. So again, very, very hopeful. And I, for one, am watching what happens in Brazil very closely. It would be amazing to see Lula get back in power. So, at the end of the day, there's three things that are going to determine the success of these various movements to transform our civilization from our current trajectory of collapse to one in which sustainability, equality, peace, freedom, all of that reigns. Three things we have to think about: context, consciousness, and movement. So context means basically what's going on in the world. Like, is there feedback that our current system is not working? And in that sense, folks, the context is right. We're seeing it all over the world. We're seeing intensifying climate catastrophes. Again, we're seeing warfare break out between the world's major powers. We're seeing rising inequality, political instability. So the context is there. We know that the crisis is building, right? Consciousness basically means, are people aware of the fact that change is needed? And I would argue that, from my sense of things, that is growing too. More and more people are dissatisfied with governments, with the status quo, with the way the world works. And a lot of them, even people that I have maybe criticized in this course. So for instance, folks who believe in QAnon, or that the world is run by lizard people or whatever. Even though I think those people are mistaken in their beliefs, I think that part of their beliefs are right, in the sense that they know that things are messed up. They know that things are wrong. They know that things need to change. But I think they're confused about how power actually works and what kind of change is needed. And outside of those people, there's a whole bunch of people that they know that things need to change. Maybe they don't know how, maybe they don't know exactly in what direction, but the consciousness is there. But the third thing is movement. And this is that, people that want progressive change, they need to be organized. They need that sort of collective power to actually make change happen. And that is the third piece of the puzzle that is still really trying to take shape today. It's not quite there yet, right? And so really, if we think about the future, it's the work we do today that's going to determine the future of human society, of human civilization, of literally human life on this planet. If we do the work today, if we build these movements of transformation, we could live in a paradise in a generation or so, right? It's very possible. But if we don't do that work, then things look a little bit bleak. So there's a lot of stuff to do. There's a lot to engage in order to make sure this transformation happens. And so, to leave off, folks, what everyone in this class is going to see in the coming decades is mounting crisis. That's not going to go away. It's only going to intensify, whether it's the climate crises, whether it's the instability caused by inequality, whether it is conflict between the world's superpowers. These things are going to get more intense in the coming decades. They really will. However, we are also going to see increasing possibilities and movements for positive change. So it's like a neck and neck horse race, folks. The crisis is going to intensify, and yet possibilities for change, movements for change are going to intensify as well. And I would suggest that really the question each of us has to ask, that are a part of this this course we just went through, is what can you contribute? Where do you belong? What skills can you bring to making the world a better place, a more sustainable place, more equitable, more democratic, more free, more compassionate? Each one of us can play a role. And I don't mean each one of us needs to be, marching down the street all the time, or chaining ourselves to a tree, or, whatever else, right? Or running for political office. Not each one of us can or should do those things. Some of us might, which is pretty cool, but there's all something that we can do, right? Some way that we can plug into this process. And I think it's really, really important that we do so, because literally the future of all of us depends on it, right? And it is really important to sort of leave off that, there is hope in committed collective action. I mean, if we don't if we choose not to do the work, or if we pretend that we can all just continue on as isolated individuals and everything's going to be fine, we're in big trouble. However, when we decide that we need to gather around shared values and move those shared values forward and make that movement inclusive, we really can create change. We can shift our society from collapse to sustainability. It's my sincere hope that we do so. It's my sincere hope that each of you finds a way to participate and contribute in the coming months and years. And so that's it for the end of the lecture. I hope that, again, everyone has a great break once you're done. I know you still have exams next week, and please look at the review that's been posted. And there will be marks coming very, very soon. I apologize for them being a little bit late in terms of your essay and your presentation, but you're going to definitely have those by the end of the weekend. So study hard, folks. Do well on all your exams. Take good care. And again, if you have any questions before now and the exam or the end of the course, please don't hesitate to talk to me. So I will stop that there, and I will say farewell.